Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to our podcast. So, Jens, you look so lightening today. I think we have a better light.
Well lit. Maybe it's just your presence.
My presence.
Your glowing presence.
Today, we are talking about two composers which I really never in my life I would combine. Honestly, I never thought that Mr. Mahler had something to do with Beethoven. And then suddenly I got this project in and someone told me, most of the symphonies or whatever, Mr. Mahler made some corrections, or how you tell this, retouches? Or
We use the term Retuschen, the German word. It's retouchings, but Retuschen works well, which is basically arranging it for performance, which every conductor does, but to a degree with greater liberties taken than a conductor would nowadays.
But why you say ever conductor does? I mean, I don't know if Mr. Schandobek is going on stage and doing some Mozart retouchings.
Fair enough, but for the romantic repertoire, by and large, or with Beethoven anyway, or Schumann, which we might talk about as well, most conductors arrange the score to, fit the hall, which is essentially what Mahler did and what Wagner had done before him. So that's not per se something new. At least a doubling of woodwinds is
Can you just tell me that Wagner was already the first one, or did all this Beethoven retouches?
Wagner was instrumental in getting Beethoven to the status that we know him now, being the composer. I mean, if you think of a composer, it's Beethoven. But before Wagner, he was well known by other composers and by musicians still. And Wagner made Beethoven's Ninth Symphony for a benefit concert in Leipzig, I think. And it was considered a tough sell to get people to listen to Beethoven's Ninth. And he started a whole campaign on getting people into the concerts to make them interested in Beethoven's Ninth. He started writing anonymous letters to the newspaper under, not anonymous, but under false names. And then he responded to himself, quite quirky. It was basically the first social media campaign to get people to go and get people interested, and it worked. And he, at length, justified why he retouched Beethoven to suit the orchestra of the time and the bigger halls of the time. And that's basically where Mahler picked up.
Yeah, we're talking because there, of course, a CD was coming up.
It's right here.
Here, okay. Could not watch into my laptop. Okay, a CD was coming out at Capriccio. We did this already 4 years. 2021, oh my God, time passes so fast. And I was there at the recording, during the recording, and we made a short video and watch now what the conductor has to say about.
When Mahler first did his retouching, it was quite controversial. In Vienna, they sort of felt, how can you touch Beethoven? He is sacrosanct, he is perfect, how dare you? Mahler was concerned that in the turn of the 20th century that Beethoven's classical language had lost some of the power. You think about some of the pieces that Strauss was writing, think of the pieces that Mahler was writing. So these are huge, big pieces, and he wanted Beethoven's strength to be heard. What we understand from Mahler is that he was a brilliant performer. He was far more famous in his life as a conductor than as a composer. And each of us has to balance all of Beethoven's dynamics. Very often, modern orchestra, modern instruments, different sizes, different halls. And Mahler has done it in a very creative way. And what we understand from him is that he has not changed the drama, nor the rhetoric, nor the power of the music. What he's tried to do is help that come alive. So he felt that Beethoven was struggling with orchestration because of his deafness, and he didn't want Beethoven's passion to be lost. So he adds, he doubles the winds, doubles the horns, and changes some of the orchestration in the strings so that these lines pop out of the music.
So I think this is very interesting what Michael Francis tells you about the things. Honestly, it was impressive to sit there in the studio and see suddenly the double winds and the double horns and all the things. I mean, for a CD recording, it makes not really sense.
Well, I mean, I think, as he says, these touchings, retouches were made for people because the string apparatus had grown so considerably, and then people felt the balances were now out of whack. And to get them back, you had to push the winds a little. And so it makes more sense in a big concert hall. In the studio, of course, you could just push them a little bit. I mean, Soviet recordings are famous for just really highlighting single instruments and putting them in the foreground where they never belong.
Normally you always have the English horn, you always have to push up, because it's too low. But in that case, I think they have to push down everything because there is so much. I mean, in the Ninth Symphony, I think you have 9 horns or 8 horns. I have to look now on the things and so on. I mean, this is really. But okay, I understand. In Mahler times, everything in instrumentation was big.
Generally, although that wasn't the point of Mahler's retouchings, to make it bigger, to make it more romantic in sound, the idea that Mahler at least had, and Wagner as well, and presumably most people who followed him, was not to soup it up, to make it sound more like Mahler, but to make it sound as much like Beethoven as they thought it could sound.
But for what? Only that the people in the last row, after 6,000 people there in the last row, can also listen to the symphony? Or?
Again, for the balances, because the ninth was premiered, I think, in the Kärntnertortheater, and then the second performance took place in the Redutensaal. And the Redutensaal is fairly big, but it's nothing compared to a modern concert house that has 1,500 to 2,200 seats. So to get the balances right, but Mahler goes beyond the balances. He also looks at the score of Beethoven's and sees there are some deficiencies in the instruments at the time, where clearly if the instruments could have played in certain keys, or if they had a greater range, he would have continued a melodic line instead of transposing it down and continuing it that way, or they would have continued playing the timpani where he had much less to choose from. And so these concessions to the reality of Beethoven's time were no longer necessary, and Mahler took the liberty of correcting that.
I was surprised really, because this recording was a huge success now this year. They got we got a lot of interest in it. But on the other side, I mean, we have so many people, including maybe me, that they like more the very original sound. You know, with the, how you say, Darmsaiten, with the
gut strings,
with gut strings, with the gut strings, gut strings. Okay, and for them it's really like something like the devil comes out, no?
Ultimately, it's good music making that's interesting, right? Whether it's the conductor, and who cares if it's touched up? I mean, now we want to listen to how did it sound in the composer's lifetime, which is just as big a lie as anything else, because we wouldn't know, because we'd actually have to live in those times, and we wouldn't want to hear it because the orchestras were so awful back then. That is not the point. But there's every time, every age has its aesthetic, and right now we're still maybe a little bit towards the tail end of the historically informed performance crowd, which has given us wonderful recordings of Schumann, of Beethoven, of Schubert, and everything before, of course, but that's where it matters. I find that a different orchestra or a different interpretation makes more of a difference than even those Retuschen.
But that might be an interesting question. If we have these retouches already, why they don't play it more often today? I mean, we have still these large concert houses,
It would make sense to some degree, because a lot of European orchestras, at least, have a so-called Dienst. They have to perform, that many times, rehearsals, concert performances, outreach, whatever it may be. And it can't go on that the violins have all the Diensts, and then the tubas or the trombones are basically jobless, which is, by the way, a problem why you can't play that much Mozart and Haydn, because half the orchestra has nothing to do and they can't just fiddle their thumbs. So you could employ more of the orchestra you already have by playing the Mahler Retuschen, and that would smooth things out perhaps in the administrative. But the critics would just absolutely tear a new one. In fact, critics hated Mahler even at the time. For doing the hated is a strong word, but in the Aurélien de Lagrange Mahler book, he has many of the reviews that Mahler got from his Beethoven cycle in New York, where he played symphonies 2 through 9. And the reviews were quite critical, because even then they said, Beethoven doesn't need your help. And Mahler obviously disagreed, because he really thought he was just helping to bring out the essence rather than smudging it.
Yeah, but honestly, I think Mahler did this now for his own. He wanted to fill up like his 8 symphonies, Symphony of the Thousands, then we make a Beethoven of the Thousands, or what, and we make a Bach of the Thousands, or I don't know, was this a habit of the time of Mahler?
Well, the idea that you could do that, and doing that was in fact just helping Beethoven rather than putting your own ego into it, that was of the time. But Mahler was foremost, at the time, certainly known as a conductor. And he was considered one of the most fastidious, well-meaning conductors of other people's music. And he took a lot of care, and he was certainly not a conductor to put his own personality on someone else. He had a lot of experience with concert halls and what worked and what didn't, and that's what he brought to the table. And I think the fact that he took the liberties is a sign of the times, but not actually the style in which he did it, because again, it's not really turning Beethoven to Mahler. Yes, you double the woodwinds. Yes, the balances are different. You have bigger brass section. But it doesn't mean that the entire Beethoven would come across as a minor Mahler. And in fact, I think even in the Retuschen, if we had several recordings to compare, if, for example, Herwege were to do Beethoven but in the Mahler Retuschen, it would sound very different from, say, Francis, or if Riccardo Chailly did it. Yeah. And I think that's the bigger difference than these changes in the score.
And what we have here, what he did, which retouches we have here? We have here the Symphony number 5, Symphony number 3, the Symphony number 7 and 9. And then comes the overtures, Leonore number 3, and Coriolan, and there's also Leonore number 2. And then is this little string quartet. Opus, I need to clean my glasses. Okay, this little string quartet, Opus 95. Yeah, is this all what you did?
It's not all, but it also depends on what you define a retusche to be. We know that Mahler conducted Beethoven from his own scores, and all his scores had some modifications in them, as any conductor would, do. And he did symphonies at least 2 through 9. I'm not sure he ever actually conducted Symphony number 1. If he did, there's no score surviving, and that would be surprising.
Maybe he did it in original.
No, that's not, because the 4th, for example, he just didn't need any help. Okay. And the 6th really didn't need any help either, so those don't exist in Retuschen. And then you have to differentiate what is just arranging it, or not arranging it, but to make a performance edition, or to make your little markings in the score where you have an accent, or where you have maybe a legato, how you tell people to play, accentuations and such. But every conductor does that. That does not amount to the status of a retusche. It has to be a more considerable change of the score to amount to that status. And then you go further and you speak of an arrangement, like what he did to the Bach suites. That's an outright arrangement. That's not even a retusche. So I think that basically covers most of what he did, where he really changed the score. The 8th, apparently, he didn't change much. David Pickett, who's the foremost authority in the field and who put together the scores for the publisher, suggested as much to me, and he said, 4 and 6 didn't need his help. 8th, it's questionable. He hasn't bothered turning them into editions yet, simply because there aren't that many changes in them.
No, but as we know, he did the same kind of retouches with Schumann symphonies. I'm right?
He did, not the same kind, if you will. I have a list here of all the works that he performed from his own scores, and we can assume that he made retuschen of some sort or another to all of them. Mozart, Symphony number 40, 41, Schubert Ninth, that exists in that version, and all the Schumann symphonies.
Yeah.
And there are two recordings that I'm aware of out there. There's one with Riccardo Chailly in the Leipzig Gewandhaus Orchestra, which is very good.
From another label.
And Maren also did it recently with the RSO here in town, and I haven't listened to that one, but that's Naxos, so that's home base. And there he does something, again, he attempts to help Schumann. And that's less controversial because Schumann has always been
bad instrumentator.
Well, that's been the accusation.
Mendelssohn helped him already, no?
He did actually in the second symphony, I believe, and suggested that he transpose things because it's easier for the horns to play or for the brass. And then Mahler went back and said, okay, the Mendelssohn help here is not needed. Our brass players are good enough to do the opening of the second symphony at the intended key. And in any case, so there's this stereotype that it's almost become a truth. Schumann didn't know how to orchestrate. Mahler was a man of his time, and of course he knew that orchestras have a hard time just playing it right. Orchestra standards were not nearly at the level they're at now. So he helped everyone, or so he thought. And actually he makes the scores more transparent.
So the big conclusion is we should not be angry to Mr. Mahler.
I mean, that's so silly. No, I think the idea is to be open to diversity in music, and lo and behold, there's still diversity to be found in the Beethoven symphonies. And you said, remember in our podcast 00, that we would only talk about forgotten composers, and I said I'd be happy to talk to you about Beethoven's Fifth, and here we are, talking about Beethoven's Fifth after all.
No, we're talking about the retouches of the Beethoven Fifth. This is the discovery.
The discovery is it sounds like Beethoven's Fifth. That's the.
So please take the CD, crank it up on the stereo, and if you survive, we see us next time.